Hi there, my name is Dr. Travis Holland. I'm a senior lecturer in communication at Charles Sturt University, Australia. This podcast is an exploration into our digital society. It forms the lectures for my class, Envisioning the Digital Society, but also aims to engage you, the listener out there beyond my classroom. If you like what you hear, please send a voice comment through Anchor or Spotify or get in contact via the details in the show notes. We all know what social media is, right? It's that collection of platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, that allow us all to become content creators. But is social media really social? Is it good for society? How do we respond to the unprecedented power and influence of these global corporations? That's one topic of this episode. In conversation with a couple of knowledgeable guests, I also take a look at new developments in generative AI and have a discussion about cyberpunk. Welcome to Digital Society. Social media is a broad label for a collection of websites and apps which focus on providing tools for users to create and post content online. Social networks are a smaller part of this broader group, which focus on facilitating connections between people as their primary service. These are typically organised around profiles curated by individuals and which allow users to make posts either in multiple media formats, such as Facebook, or limited formats, such as images on Instagram and videos on TikTok. Most social networks are advertising supported businesses, and they have made the collection and passing of huge amounts of personal data a priority in order to efficiently and effectively sell ads against the user generated content filling their sites. There's an old saying that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. As a result of their effectiveness in advertising, social networks and other digital platforms have deeply undermined the traditional mass media business model. And it's not because they're stealing content, it's simply because they're better at selling advertisers that content. The earliest recognizable social networks launched in the mid 1990s. These included GeoCities, Classmates, and 6 Degrees. 6 Degrees was the first which included the ability to fill in a profile. Like other emerging websites and digital platforms, many of these were impacted by the dot-com crash. After the dust settled on that upheaval, new players arrived. These included Friendster and MySpace in 2003, and finally Facebook in 2004. But social media has also taken other forms. Blogs, sites like YouTube, virtual worlds, review platforms, and even podcasts can all be considered social media, even if they're not social networks. Social networks have been accused of facilitating genocide, see Facebook in Myanmar, of undermining democracy in the US and elsewhere, and of causing Tourette's like tics in teenagers. However, during the pandemic, their effectiveness in connecting people was underlined. Since TikTok tends to function primarily by the recommendation algorithms rather than the profile based of earlier social networking sites, it may not even be considered social media. It's just a feed of content, quite similar to Netflix, for example. What do you think? Is TikTok a social network? Is it social media? Where does it fit? The other interesting thing about social media companies is that they've become hugely powerful and they're big political players. They're giant corporations. This tends to me to sound a bit like the corporations of cyberpunk, this dystopian world where technology, flesh, fiber intermingle. I had a conversation with Dr. David Cameron about cyberpunk, and that's what I'm going to play now. You may know the term cyberpunk from the recent video game by that name, Cyberpunk 2077, but while that game certainly adopted a certain recognizable cyberpunk aesthetic, the idea has a much longer and deeper history. A cyberpunk world is one in which the human body is a commodity at the mercy of techno-capitalist systems. it's vaguely futuristic, but also lives in the here and now. And to talk about cyberpunk with me today, Dr. David Cameron, Senior Lecturer in Communication here at Charles Sturt. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Travis. How are you?
Yeah, going okay.
Here we are in cyberspace. Who'd have thought?
Right, that's exactly the thing. Cyberpunk always has this kind of futuristic tone to it, but where it's most valuable for us to think about is what aspects of cyberpunk are living now. So we'll come to that. What is cyberpunk?
Good question. I mean, at its fundamental definition, you would describe it as a subgenre of fiction, and particularly, I would say, speculative fiction or perhaps science fiction. So it comes out of a fictional storytelling genre, but there is a kind of aesthetic or worldview that comes with it. And I think, the cyber is probably self-explanatory. Anyone that's read some of the materials in this subject, for example, would understand we're talking about technology. The cyber in cyberpunk particularly is related to digital networks, that sense of cyberspace, the matrix, the web, the internet, um, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, the blending or augmentation of humans with technology, that sense of plugging in and downloading into our brains. So the cybernetic. So the cyber, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. The punk bit is interesting. So if you think about punk music, and you and I are kind of old enough to kind of see punk music as a genre of music, Travis. It's probably become a little bit more mainstream now, but there was an aesthetic around punk music which emerged sort of in the 60s and 70s around rebelling or responding to the kind of corporatism around rock music, around popular music, being anti-brand, anti-government, living outside kind of normal society or even outside the law, and a kind of do-it-yourself approach as well, which is interesting. That idea of, um, in punk music, it was the sense of you don't have to be the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. I can go down, pick up a second-hand guitar. As long as I can learn three chords and yell a lot, I can be in a punk band. Cyberpunk has this sort of similar thing where it's about high technology, but often about the everyday, or the classic kind of definition of cyberpunk is low life, people living on the edge, outlaws, criminals, you and I, Travis, but high tech. And it's an interesting blend. So it's a kind of compendium word, cyber and punk. And together it has that sense of high technology, but anti-establishment, anti-corporate, do-it-yourself, living outside the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we see that in, well, probably the prototypical, the most well-known cyberpunk story out there is William Gibson's Neuromancer, I would say, which is a story about this kind of ex-hacker, that used to go into a mainframe, and for in this world, in this future, the mainframes are very physical. They're something you see whenever you're kind of plugged in. And Neuromancer is about the way that the systems kind of has spat this guy out, Case, and his journey to get plugged back in, because it's become a kind of drug for him, but also he's rebelling and fighting against the people that control it. So
yeah, and it's that, this is where the concept of the Matrix comes from. If you think about the films, The Matrix, this idea of data being a kind of visual space, a three-dimensional space that you can exist in. Gibson's work, particularly Neuromancer, which is from about 1984, I think. I think one of the terms in that book, he talks about, going into this space. Case goes into this space through a kind of console, but then it's a very visual way to navigate through data. And he talks about a consensual hallucination. That going into somewhere like that is it is like going into another world, into another space. And there's elements of kind of hallucination, drug culture, hippiness often about cyberpunk as well, which is kind of interesting.
There's also a sense of transness, so transhumanism comes out of this, and a kind of not only is everybody the same, but no, not really the same because if people are often customized with technology, but everybody is kind of equal in the sense that they have access to the same technologies to upgrade and to choose, and they get to choose their own destiny, I guess, which is an interesting way of looking at the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about cyberpunk, which is interesting for us in a subject like this, is it's often the technology, as high end or extreme or speculative as it may be, it's often every day in that world. It's
Mm,
often it's part of the everyday world. It's the fabric of the world in which the stories are set. You're right. There's often a kind of ubiquity to it. Everyone has it. Everyone wants it. And there's or even everyone ignores it. Like it's kind of there in the background,
mm,
but people just kind of go, "That's the world we live in." And I think you can sort of see why cyberpunk resonates readily with us in the way our lives are at the moment, because there's so much of technology, high end technology, really, when you think about it, particularly how quickly we've reached this point, that we're carrying around mobile computers in our pockets and,
mm,
you and I are talking via the network now, we kind of take it for granted. And I think that's part of the world of cyberpunk. It's often, it's not speculative future, imagine if this stuff. It's basically saying this is the world we live in, and
yep.
then interesting things happen.
And how do you deal with that? So,
Mm.
what aspects of the world are most cyberpunkish now?
um, I think, well, firstly, that sense of everyday and everywhere technology, and I think it's interesting. We mentioned William Gibson and neuromancer, which is where some of these terms come from. He didn't invent cyberpunk per se, but the concept of cyberspace and the Matrix comes from that work, coinciding at around the same time when computers moved out of universities and governments and banks into our homes. It was the rise of the personal
Yep.
computer, your kind of Commodore 64 and, your Apple IIc and those kinds of things. So there's a kind of interesting timing there where at the same time that cyberpunk was becoming quite popular, early to mid 80s, those technologies were moving into our homes. And I think that everyday, everywhere thing is quite interesting, and it's something that we should be alert to. What are we taking for granted that is actually, part of, um, this kind of technological shift, if you like, and how is it shaping our society, and what are people doing with it? That's kind of one aspect of it. I think the other thing that is quite dominant in a lot of cyberpunk literature is that sense of do it yourself. And more particularly, that users of technology find ways to use the technology that were perhaps never intended by
Mm,
the designers of that technology. And again, to quote William Gibson, the author, here's a quote basically along the lines of the street finds uses for things that designers never imagined. Um, and I think if we're thinking about digital technology, I think it's interesting for us to sit back and try and look at how we use things, everyday things like our mobile phones and computers and even the software that's on those things, and think about what was designed from the start. The people who created these things, what was the functionality they intended versus how do we actually use it? How do we as societies and people actually use it? I think that's another
mm.
interesting thing for us to look at.
And that's, of course, the deeper level. But often in cyberpunk, you get the characters pushing back against these corporations, against the kind of control of governments, and particularly corporations. And now we can see that in, I used to teach about digital dissent, which was a really interesting subject, looking at protests and all sorts of things. And I think right now, one of the real cyberpunk movements we're seeing is often when there's a protest, you'll get police forces and others deploying facial recognition technologies. And so people are now wearing masks specifically designed to not only confound those technologies and hide their identity, but in some cases they've got patterns on them that are meant to actually crash the computers and actually
Yeah,
crash the algorithms.
yeah, and I think, I mean, that is also a really dominant theme in cyberpunk, right? The capitalism, um, corporations, and particularly corporations blurring the line between commerce and control. In a
Hmm.
lot of cyberpunk literature, corporations are kind of de facto governments. Governments have almost become irrelevant apart from you know maybe maintaining a police force that is nowhere near as corrupt as the corporations in that
Yeah.
world. And I think, yeah, and the sense of operating underneath that, freedom, liberty, protest. And you're right. I mean, there's nothing kind of more cyberpunk than some of the images that came out of the Hong Kong protests, a year or so ago, of people literally, as you say, wearing kind of camouflage, and not kind of army camouflage, but kind of disruptive patterns
Mm.
and things, and modifying their appearance to cameras. To the surveillance cameras being deployed on them to try and disrupt the artificial intelligence facial recognition. That photos of people dressed like that against the neon cityscape of Hong Kong are about as cyberpunk as you can get, I
Yeah.
think.
The aesthetic also, while you get this kind of neon perspective, it also tends to blend Asian cosmopolitanism with kind of Western influences as well, and you see that in Neuromancer. The opening scenes in Neuromancer take place in Tokyo. I think Tokyo, at least Japan. Um, Blade Runner's LA is kind of very Singapore, Hong Kong influenced in Blade Runner. Yeah, so you get these kinds of melding of cultures as well, very often.
Yeah, and again, I think partly it's the blurring of national borders. It's quite common in cyberpunk literature. Again, it's this sense of massive urban sprawl, very much a kind of global world. Yeah, you're right. Asian culture is quite dominant in a lot of that fiction, and I think partly because
When compared to other popular media, for
yeah,
example.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly, and the idea of mega cities and mega sprawls is kind of quite dominant in cyberpunk literature as well.
Yeah.
Um,
I found it quite interesting. This is totally off topic, but I found it quite interesting when in the Detective Pikachu movie that the city in that was almost a cyberpunk sort of city. It was real kind of sort of scungy at night time, and a lot of the early scenes took place in the back alleys that were lit up by neon and in these dank cafes.
yeah,
While
that's
there's
right. I mean,
Pokemon running around the streets.
and this is kind of the world of cyberpunk. Again, it's that punk thing, like punk music pushed back against kind of corporate rock and roll and corporate pop music. Cyberpunk as a literary genre pushed back against speculative fiction and science fiction
Mm,
from that was about that gleaming perfect civilizations and big silver spaceships, and everyone's kind of wafting around like a kind of neo-Roman world in futuristic togas, kind
yeah.
of and you press a button and you feel happy and all this kind of stuff. There was or hard science. The other stuff that was going on in science fiction was really hard science. It was almost like it was being written by scientists. Everything had to be meticulously researched and true about the real world. And then you get cyberpunk, which is about the back alleys and the dirty cafes and the
Yeah.
sex, drugs, and rock and roll version of all that, with technology laid over the top. It's no, I mean, there's a lot of cyberpunk that connects to detective fiction, crime fiction,
Mm,
particularly sort of that 1940s American, private detective type story.
yeah.
They're
Yeah.
down and out. They're almost criminal themselves. They live in a world of low lives, pimps and and criminals and drug dealers, and Cyberpunk really taps into that more than it taps into the gleaming vision of,
Yeah.
magnificent silver stainless steel worlds that we all live in.
Your comment that the streets find a use for everything, almost the streets find a use for people in cyberpunk worlds as well. People inhabit the streets, particularly these night sort of scape streets, I think,
Yeah,
for
it's people
sure.
going about their lives, often kind of mundane lives in a way, but it's how they engage with the technology, or how the technology uses them, that often becomes the starting point for an interesting story. And to get back to the point of looking around the world now, looking at the way that we interact with a lot of technology, and this sense of, are we using the machines, or are the machines using
Mm.
us, and who owns the machines? That's
Yeah, I mean that was the literal theme of the Matrix, right? The Matrix really pushed that to the extreme. It, the machines using us as batteries, or machines for our use, kind of. But you even get it running through. You even get the theme kind of running through other science fiction. I think where science fiction kind of picks up on cyberpunk or whatever it may be. And of course, I think Dune was probably written before this, but it's almost got that same theme of ultimately in Dune, the society has pushed back against technology altogether and rid the universe of computers.
Yeah, Dune's interesting, and Dune is it is in the older form of speculative fiction that kind of predates cyberpunk, but rather than being about the hard science, it's also what you would call a kind of space opera. It's this
Mm.
big epic, the factions and the families and whatever. But I mean, the other interesting thing going on in Dune is you have this kind of guerrilla warfare going on, and again, it's that kind of almost DIY
Yep.
technology pushing back against the kind of colonial powers. It's an interesting
What
thing.
you can kind of crib together to fight back. Yeah, absolutely. Dave, just a couple more points to have a chat about. We talked about kind of what's cyberpunk in the world now, and one way to think about that is a phrase that William Gibson is said to have said repeatedly, although no one ever seems to be able to track down the original source, and that is that the future is here; it's just unevenly distributed. Or there's an interview in NPR.
So I've said many times the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And I see what I do as pinpointing or pointing in the very general direction of the parts where change is emerging. And that these changes emerging sufficiently quickly these days that can very easily pass for prescience if you don't look at it too closely.
I think what's interesting, we talk about speculative fiction and science fiction, and it's very easy to think of what authors like Gibson and others are doing is, visualizing the future, the distant future. But what he says and others say about a lot of cyberpunk is that at best it's about the near future, if not the present. But and what he's doing, what Gibson says he's doing, is actually just kind of looking around the world now and piecing bits together. So that sense of it's not evenly distributed yet, in the sense that it's not obvious to us, but the near future is here. The technologies that are emerging now are going to shape the world that we live in, but not in the distance.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they're shaping pockets of the world we live in now. So, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, those kinds of things. And I think Gibson talks about actually talking about an unthinkable present rather than speculating about the future. He's kind of trying to imagine where we're at now, which is kind of a challenge for us too, right? And the other thing is, I mean, other authors do it
Well,
too.
I think it's a challenge for students. This is something we should ask students to think about. People who are having the opportunity to make that world.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the other thing about cyberpunk, there's a kind of chicken and egg question there. is it just kind of piecing together and reflecting where technology is headed, or how much has it shaped where technology is headed? How much of the technologists, Silicon Valley and the Elon Musks and Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, how much is their idea or their vision of apps and platforms and technology been shaped by reading fiction like this, or been inspired by reading fiction like this, versus the William Gibsons of the world just kind of seeing what those folk are doing and what the engineers are doing and what the coders are doing and all those kinds of stuff, and kind of speculating about it. So there's a kind of chicken and egg thing, really. And again, it's interesting for us to think, what if the world that we're living in now can be shaped in that way, and what would we like to do to shape it?
Yeah, absolutely. Sam Altman, I was reading yesterday, he's the CEO of OpenAI, which of course produced that ChatGPT tool that everybody went crazy over the last few months. I was reading about his bolt hole up in Big Sur in California. His moment to go off the grid when AI takes over the world. Like, quite literally, this is what the guy who's running the world's biggest AI company is afraid is going to happen. And he's got it stocked with gold and food and whatever else he thinks he's going to need to survive.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a guy called Ray Kurzweil, who's a kind of futurist technologist, an American, and he wrote a lot, going back decades now, about artificial intelligence and the kind of technology curve. How technology kind of is an exponential curve, and where it's leading to in terms of things like artificial intelligence. And he talks about the kind of singularity, where everything just kind of collapses into this point where it's a bit like a black hole, but it's a kind of societal, technological black hole where everything just becomes, a kind of artificial reality world. There's a little bit of kind of, I don't know, the madness to it.
Yeah,
I think. But Ray Kurzweil's sort of angle on it was, and it's interesting for us to think about this, our human view of the world. Like, humans evolved in a kind of analog world, right? So our senses are designed, eyesight, hearing is designed for kind of analog data, and our view is very much kind of at the horizon level. When we look at the world, we look out as far as we can see, and it's partly about trying to spot, antelopes on the horizon to hunt down and eat, or kangaroos or something. But we have this horizon view, very flat view of technology is exponential. It just, boom, it's a logarithmic curve. And that's why we have a lot of trouble seeing the future and seeing where technology is headed, because we're kind of not wired up for it. Even though we've created this stuff, we tend to look at life linearly, horizontally, flatly, because that's how we're wired up. And so the challenge for us, and in subjects like this, to think about technology, to talk about digital technology, is to try and not just look at the horizon, raise the eyes a little bit and think about where's it heading, and not in the distant future. That kind of exponential graph means it's tomorrow, or the week after, or the month after, or the year after, not the decade after or the century after. It's what technology is going to look like in a year is very different to what it looks like now, and then so on and so on and so on. So I think, how do we do that? Are there tools we can use to help us? Are there resources we can draw upon to say, what is the future of my industry? What is the future of journalism? What's the future of content creation? What's the next TikTok? What is Chat GPT, or what's the next artificial intelligence? Even bigger and better than Chat GPT. Like, what's next? How do we pick that? Travis, tell me, help me. What do I do?
What company should I invest in tomorrow?
Yeah.
These are really important questions, and I think hopefully the social, hopefully, where am I going with this? I think sci-fi and cyberpunk, one of the reasons it's useful to talk about in a sort of academic context is that it can start to help us imagine some of these futures.
Yeah, and I think that idea of thinking about everyday stuff that's around us, or if you are thinking about stuff that's a little bit new and a little bit kind of high tech, like artificial intelligence, those kinds of things, how will it be adopted by the mainstream, not just by kind of the elite or by corporations or governments, but what's the kind of what's the back alley version of this stuff? Like what's the day to day version of this stuff? And can I see signs of that happening already? How it's I mean, with artificial intelligence, okay, we talk about the ability of artificial intelligence to generate images by putting in text. Interior designers and architects are using that to create completely fictional room layouts for brochures for built off the plan, housing units.
Yeah.
It's a very simple day-to-day use of that stuff. It's not, and yet it could become the dominant way in which you go to a real estate site to speculate about, is that the kind of off-the-plan unit I want to buy in Sydney? And everything on it is just completely generated, by a clerk, by the intern, by the work placement person in the architect's office typing in a few keywords,
into
2-bedroom flat facing
into Midjourney, or for sure.
Yeah.
Well, one task I've asked the students to do this week, and if anybody who's not a student is listening in and wants to do this, is to create a piece of cyberpunk inspired artwork, or write a cyberpunk themed short story. So, if if anybody wants to come up with some ideas and perhaps create their own future.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think I'd go down the art path. I'm completely not arty, but there's something about the visual aesthetic of cyberpunk that I think is really interesting. As you say, some of it's that completely over the top, like Tokyo on steroids, neon world, which is kind of interesting. But there's also the kind of there is the dark underbelly, the someone sitting at home plugged into their console, wired up. I think there's some interesting things there. I feel a bit kind of plugged in and wired up at the moment talking to you, Travis.
If anybody's thinking about the cyberpunk in the here and now, I think one of the really cyberpunk projects that's underway is NEOM, this kind of government-led reinvestment in the Middle East, and they're planning to create a city that is essentially built in a long, thin, narrow strip with mirrors on all sides, and essentially all the services take place within a kind of narrow couple of 100-meter city. The desert's on the outside, so
completely artificial. I mean, I guess just occurred to me when we're talking about cyberpunk and the present. I mean, you only have to look at cybersecurity, right? As we're living kind of the cyberpunk world now. Cybersecurity is just endlessly in the news. We have a cybersecurity, research project going on at Charles Sturt, hacking, our data, breaches. I mean, that's cyberpunk. We're living it, right? Data has value. Data is the new kind of mining world. People are mining us and robbing us blind of our data, and we're living it. We're living the cyberpunk dream.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, thanks so much for joining me to talk about cyberpunk.
No worries. Apologies for talking too much, if anything.
Not at all. Following on from the chat about cyberpunk, I also decided to record a conversation with Jasmine Connell, who's a PhD student at the University of Wollongong. Jasmine's looking at, amongst other things, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence programs like ChatGPT have caused a bit of a stir lately, and we haven't even seen yet the entrance of the big players like Google into this space, although Microsoft has released a version of their search platform Bing, which is enhanced by its integration with an AI. Here's my chat with Jasmine.
Hello, I'm Jasmine. I am a PhD student at the University of Wollongong, and I'm doing my PhD on non-human online persona. And I'm also a tutor or teacher at the University of Wollongong in media and communications, and I mainly focus on digital media and communications.
What is online non-human persona?
Oh, that's a bit of a heavy one, straight up. It is, so persona is the everyday performance of self, so we can think of that as sort of an identity theory, but not. It's the ways that we present ourselves in public, and I'm particularly interested in how we present ourselves online using things like social media and other things on the internet. But I'm also interested in taking all the existing theories about persona, which primarily align with humans, and applying them to non-human things like AI, pet influencers, and game characters.
Cool. Well, I'm glad you mentioned AI because that's what you've agreed to have a chat with me today about. Lots of people got very excited, worried, freaked out when ChatGPT released their generative AI. Sorry, when OpenAI released their generative AI ChatGPT last year, and then of course we've had Microsoft's new Bing integrated AI since then. And a lot of people don't really know what we're talking about yet. So we just cover a bit of ground and let's have a chat about AI. What are you seeing out there around these kinds of AIs?
Well, we'd already be quite familiar with social media algorithms. That's the most recognizable form of AI we'd see every day, as well as Google search, Bing search, things like that. But in terms of generative AI, I did some digging into this, and there is so many of them out there. So we've got ChatGPT, Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion. They're all image generators. Grammarly is a good one that we use quite often. There's heaps of text generators out there, like Jasper AI, Writer. Deepfakes is one that people are quite concerned about, understandably. And besides from that, there's heaps of generative AI popping up around creative things like game development, image editing, video generating, and music generating, and vocal generating as well for audiobooks and stuff.
Yeah. I might say with deepfakes for a moment, this has been something that's been, as you mentioned, generating some concern for a while. Deepfake is this notion that you can use an AI to automatically sort of edit a video and put somebody else's face or voice on the video, for example, or produce a photograph that looks like it's speaking using these kind of advanced technologies. And it's been used for revenge porn, and it's also been used for misinformation, political misinformation, and all sorts of things. So it's a kind of advanced editing tool for videos to produce videos that people look at on the surface and say that looks real, but it's not, and that can cause obviously some problems for lots of people out there. So yeah, AI has been around for a little while, but these new generative tools that have started to come out in the last 6 months, 12 months, or come to the public consciousness have really broken through for a little while, but they are part of a bigger suite of tools. Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned algorithms as well. For a long time, recommendation algorithms have been driving our lives on social media, on what we watch on Netflix. Those are forms of AI as well. None of these have really reached what might be called artificial general intelligence, though, which is the state at which it really is difficult to tell the difference between a human and these technologies. You might not have highly technical knowledge on this yet, but where do we think that line is, Jasmine?
I've read a little bit about artificial general intelligence, and I do agree with you that we are nowhere near that. And I actually got us a little statistic about this. People are predicting that we might reach AGI around 2040.
Mm-hmm.
Which
It's
is
still a while away.
quite soon.
Yeah.
It's still a while away. And then there was also this term called superintelligence, which is sort of off the back of AGI, these computers that are so intelligent that they can improve themselves. And it's almost the last invention you ever need to make, because it will then take over inventing new things. So that was predicted to come about 20 years after AGI. Mm-hmm. And that's what we often see in sci-fi movies, is the all-controlling AIs that take over the world.
Yeah.
We need to rebel against.
But for our purposes, these kind of generative AIs, which, simply put, the way that the text models work, for example, is they find the most likely word to follow any given previous word. And so just like Google searches the internet, these things sort of search their existing databases and figure out the most likely word to follow the word that they've just chosen. And they therefore produce text that looks often on the surface to be quite accurate. So it's starting to produce some concern. I've seen literary magazines express concern. They're starting to find lots of submissions, sort of low-quality submissions generated quickly by some of these AIs, or rather by people using these AIs and submitted to the magazines, and they've actually finding that they're getting flooded with these submissions, which is a bit of a frustrating or surprising development. And it points to some of the concern in artistic communities, as if these things are producing content, whether or not we might call it high quality or artistic content, where does that leave human creators?
Yeah, it's the big question with all these developments. And my personal perspective on it is that it is still a tool that we can learn how to use to assist us in the creative process. That's not to say that it's not going to take over certain elements of jobs, the same way that computers took over certain elements of jobs, and that's just now the norm. But there is some quite serious ethical concerns around copyright and how these AIs are trained, because as you mentioned earlier, they do work off databases, but they're also a black box. So we don't actually know what the database is, where they scraped that data from, and we also don't know how it's making its decisions, because it doesn't generally tell us that. I mean, ChatGPT will attempt to give you an explanation, but at the end of the day, the AI itself does not understand the decision it makes. It just comes to that decision.
And we can really see that with, in an obvious way, with images of people quite often, which are generated with additional. I particularly saw a striking set of images the last couple of days, which were sort of dance poses and unusual poses. And because those images often feature limbs sort of contorted in strange ways, the AI can't figure it out. It kind of knows, okay, the flesh color goes here on this background in roughly this position, but it doesn't know not to give a person two limbs on the same side, right? Two arms or multiple hands or lots more fingers, for example, because it doesn't know what those things actually are.
Lots of trouble with hands and fingers. It's actually one of the ways you can recognize an AI image immediately. And eyes as well. I've noticed it's a little bit of trouble.
Teeth too, I find it doesn't.
Just anything detailed.
Yeah.
It doesn't do a great job, but from far away and landscape stuff, it does all right.
It raises a question of how we engage with images, because if we're just sort of scrolling past an image, you might not spend the time to look at it in a lot of detail. And so it might go, oh yeah, that's interesting, and you move on in a second or two. And if you're not actually paying attention, you can assume it's a quality image, when if you looked at it more closely, you'd go, oh, actually that elbow shouldn't be there.
Person's got 7 fingers.
Yeah.
Too many hands.
Exactly. Where do we think this is going? Let's get speculative, Jasmine. What do you think is going to happen?
I love that question because this is actually what I'm also doing in my thesis. So I've got a whole chapter dedicated to discussing where I think this is going, and it's something I've discussed with Dr. Chris Moore quite a bit. In the next few years, we will obviously see a lot more of these tools. I personally think it's going to become like Adobe, where someone's going to acquire all the different tools and you'll have a subscription similar to Adobe and choose, ChatGPT, Midjourney, various things, and we'll start accessing it that way.
Mm-hmm.
They've already gone behind paywalls, but I think the paywalls are going to get more solid and more rigid, and once the people who are developing them have tested them enough, they'll no longer be free. So that's what I think in terms of how we'll access them. But in terms of their capabilities, it really is endless because it's just getting so advanced at such an exponential rate. Like, it's not inconceivable that in the next 5 or 10 years you can log into Netflix and tell Netflix what you want to watch, and it will on the spot give you that TV show by drawing on a database of various things. So I think we'll see more on-demand things like that. But otherwise, I did have a little bit of a list, but I've lost it. If you have anything,
That's okay. Well, I think that's an interesting notion. What if Netflix starts deploying this kind of tech and uses generative AI to sort of build TV shows on the fly? We've already seen them experiment with Choose Your Own Adventure TV on a couple of occasions. There was one in the Camp Cretaceous series last year, and they most famously did it with Black Mirror, where there was an episode where you can choose the ending, right? But those pathways, although they branch off in a couple of different directions, often end up back in the same place. And they're not necessarily, the choices are personalized, but the response isn't personalized. So the notion that maybe we'll see a TV show where you can make a choice and it gives you what you want is interesting.
Yeah. Well, with the current technology and how fast it's progressing, it's not impossible that could happen quite soon. And the other one that I wanted to bring up as well is how we access information on the internet is already governed by algorithms, and that's got its own set of issues with bias and stuff like that. But is our search engine going to become like Bing search, where you type it in and instead of getting a list of results, you're getting one answer given to you by the AI?
So you no longer have to, or no longer are able to, might be a more correct way, choose the best answers.
Yeah.
Choose the ones that look the most right or the most authoritative to you. You are required to trust the technology, and that's what we're seeing with Bing. I've been playing with the Bing one for the last couple of days, and I'm feeding it stuff that I'm already working on. Stuff, usually where I've already written something, and so I know what I'm doing with it. And then I say, okay, what would you do with this? Because I want to see what it does compared to what I would do. And on a couple of occasions, it does sort of throw something in, and you go, oh yeah, I didn't say that very clearly, or I didn't include that bit of information which could be included. And so that's perhaps one way you can actually use these things productively, I think. Compare and contrast your own thoughts rather than, we would hope that people don't just rely on the generative AI to write their work entirely. But if you think of it as an assistant, think of it even as a bit of peer review of saying, does this make sense based on what this technology is throwing up? It can, help generate ideas and gaps and those kinds of things quite helpfully, I think.
Yeah, 100%. Like, the thing about AI is it thinks in a way that we don't think. So quite often it's very useful at exactly what you said, taking what you've already written or something you've already produced and seeing how the AI would think about it. But the major concern with these tools is that there are people that are going to see it as a shortcut and are going to see it as the easy way out. We've had a lot of discussions at UOW surrounding how we approach this with students, especially, because we're aware that people are going to try it. And we kind of came to a similar conclusion to yourself, that people should be using these as assistants rather than a replacement of the work itself. So our first years aren't allowed to use it because they need to get those skills for themselves first. And then they can use the AI to assist them from there.
So different institutions are responding differently. My institution, CSU, has come to a position that you can use these technologies in assignments if the academic has specifically allowed it in the subject outline. So it has to be specifically allowed and therefore guided by the academic staff member. And if it's not given that endorsement in text, in that legal document, the subject outline, then it can't be used.
Yeah, UOW is exactly the same university-wide. But that's just an example of how two different subjects are approaching it, because I'm teaching a first year and a third year, and the first years aren't allowed to use it, third years are.
Right.
So
That's,
it's very interesting, all the different approaches.
I happened to read an article just today in The Conversation, which is talking about potential options for universities and responding to this kind of stuff. And one of the suggestions they used was to have students producing rich media like podcasts, for example. And I'm like, on the surface that works, but you can just as easily ask these technologies to produce a podcast script as you can a sort of formal essay. So where does that leave you? And not only that, you can have the AI put voices, AI generated voices to text as well. So in theory, you can start now producing podcasts that are entirely AI generated, which poses very interesting questions about even those rich media assessments.
Yes, that's exactly right. With the current tools that we have now, you could script, produce, and edit a podcast entirely through the AI and not have to do much at all.
Yeah, exactly. Jasmine, is there anything else you wanted to raise or have a chat about? We've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time.
I think we've covered a lot of ground. I know we were going to talk about specifically comms and media jobs.
Comms roles.
I saw an interesting case, you might have seen it as well, the first official copyright case for Midjourney came to a conclusion recently, and this was in the US, and it's a comic book where all of the images were created with Midjourney, and they came to the conclusion that the author could not copyright those images that Midjourney produced, and they said that's because Midjourney did the creating and the person entering the prompt was merely directing Midjourney what to do. So there's already these discussions about, sort of what percentage of role does the AI have versus the human? How do we police that for copyright? So that's going to be quite interesting for people working in media and comms, because they have to be aware of copyright laws, but also how to use these tools and not get in trouble.
Yeah, and I guess if the copyright isn't vested or if copyright can't be embedded in the work because it's been generated by technology rather than a human, then it takes away the economic incentive to engage in these activities in the first place, potentially.
Yes, which is the concern for creators and anyone working in the creative industry.
Yeah.
Like on top of the concern of these things potentially taking over areas of your job itself. So it's going to be interesting to see what that precedent does for future cases.
It takes me back to a case from about 10 or 12 years ago where there was a camera left in the jungle and monkeys effectively took photos and took selfies with the camera. And the photographer who owns the equipment tried to claim the copyright, but it was determined that because the monkeys had actually captured the photos or the selfies, they couldn't be copyrighted because you can't vest copyright in an animal, which is the same sort of
That's exactly
concept.
the same thing what they've said. Yeah, it was interesting because they said you can copyright the text in the comic book because we're assuming that was written by the author, but just all the images weren't able to be copyrighted.
Yeah,
which is a little bit of a concern for people who were hoping to use Midjourney commercially.
Yeah, absolutely. Jasmine, thanks so much. We covered so much there. It was a really interesting chat. I appreciate you joining me for it.
Thanks for having me.
For the final part of the episode, I'm going to switch to the case study by Dr. Tracy Edmondson.
Social media, really social, is it good for society? A headline sort of caught my eye late last year, which was around a London coroner ruling that the death of a young girl resulted from social media. And whilst, this is quite an extreme, I guess, and disturbing, way to highlight one of the, I guess, the very negative sides and possibilities of today's social media landscape, I think, it's important to see whilst social media presents many opportunities, there are also many challenges that, that aren't necessarily all good for society. I guess part of this subject also, one of the readings that you were given was from Bruns, who talked about when you are trying to study internet, social media, etc., that you should look at it through the lens of society's interactions with it, not just the internet, so to speak. I similarly did this when I looked at the impact of social media through the lens of professional sport in Australia. And I adopted that framework. It was a mediatisation framework, and the idea was that in studying the transformation of the media, it's necessary to study the transformation of everyday life, culture and society in the context of the transformation of the media. So it's very similar to the approach that Bruns has recommended here. So as such, I looked at this question whilst highlighting one of the, I guess the disturbing negatives. I looked at that question of, is it good for society through the lens of how I looked at social media and its impact on sport. And one of the things that came out of my thesis that really, I guess, was how the sporting basically how sporting organisations or what they believe is news or newsworthy has changed. So we're talking about, again, is it good for society? Those of you who've studied journalism and are aware of code of ethics will probably be able to relate to that. Is it in the public interest? So traditionally, media in line with the industry's code of ethics could publish news if it was deemed to be in. One of the people that I interviewed, really quite aptly described the more current environment as, feeling like we're in a period of time where the public interested is the structuring force, not the public interest. Meaning, if the public's interested in something, that they'll print it regardless of, I guess, what the outcomes are. This sort of, to me, leads to, impacts of on ethics of journalism practice, which was highlighted in another paper that I did. And the study and the talks with the people from the various sporting organisations showed that there were, many violations of core ethical standards of Australian journalism, such as striving for accuracy, doing the utmost to give a fair opportunity to reply, and achieving fair correction of errors. All of these things have sort of come about as a result of the, 24/7 news cycle.
Hello, my name is Luna. I'm from South Korea, and I was majored in industrial engineering and also double majored in global media. I hope I'll do best in Bathurst CSU.
Thanks to Dr. Tracy Edmondson, Dr. David Cameron, and Jasmine Connell for joining me on this episode. I hope you'll stick around for future episodes of Digital Society. My name is Travis Holland. Talk to you next time.